All right. Hello, everybody. So this is one of our this is one of our videos in the section of the class on business ethics, which is basically philosophy and the office. And the title of this essay is Attacking with the North, Affirmative Action in the Office. And this is from when Michael Scott says, a quote from Abraham Lincoln. He says, "If you are racist, then we will attack you with the North." Funny, kind of silly. So anyway, so we're going to get a substantive argument or several substantive arguments about objections to affirmative action as a practice in the workplace. So that's kind of where we're headed. And so we can't forget that we are doing some real philosophy here. Okay. First of all, what is affirmative action? This is an important question when we're going to be talking about it so much. So it's the practice of seeking to include particular groups, minority groups, based on their race or gender or sexuality or creed. That means kind of religion, right? In areas where those groups have been largely underrepresented in schools, businesses, and government, right? And so job applicants are based on their, or are selected based on their individual merits, right? But having a minority status or being a minority functions as a reason in the decision-making process, where if you have a qualified minority applicant and say a very qualified majority applicant, the minority applicant will be preferred, even though if we just base it on merit, right? The majority applicant has more merit, right? So race, creed, gender, sexuality, those function as reasons in our decision-making process for who to pick for various jobs. And so this essay is just about affirmative action in the context of the workplace, right? So we're not talking about affirmative action in schools, in government, right? We're just talking about it in business. Okay. So let's see. So here are some tentative justifications for affirmative action. I'm going to move my face down here. Good. Here are 4 tentative justifications for affirmative action, why we should have affirmative action. So the first justification is that it promotes diversity in the workplace. So if we have affirmative action, well, then clearly we're going to have a more diverse pool of employees, right? Because we're selecting people based on race, right? And so we're promoting diversity in the workplace. Second tentative justification is that affirmative action can or should eliminate individual racism or minority favoring hiring practices, right? Or excuse me, majority favoring hiring practices, right? So, so one tentative goal or justification for why affirmative action is being used is that it can eliminate racism. Justification 3, tentative justification 3, is that affirmative action provides a kind of compensation to the descendants of injustice, or a kind of punishment to majority groups. So Johnson, our author, is not super clear about number 3, right? So we can distinguish the compensation question from the punishment question, right? So when you compensate somebody, that doesn't mean that you're being punished, right? It just means that you owe somebody something. And every time that you owe somebody something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're being punished for something, right? So similarly, when you're punished, you don't necessarily owe anybody anything per se, right? Rather, you've done something wrong and you're being punished for it, either for some good outcome or because your wrongdoing sort of generates a reason that you're punished. Okay, so so that's our third. So we have to kind of distinguish between 2 different justifications for the third one there, compensation and punishment. And then finally, justification 4, which is the one that Johnson actually thinks is the most plausible justification, is that affirmative action is a kind of correction of the present effects of past discrimination, right? So we live in a society structured by race. In virtue of that, some races have been excluded from political life, social life, right, have been subordinated in problematic ways. And so there's a kind of hangover, right, a socioeconomic hangover from era of slavery, at least in the American context, right? That's the way that the idea is laid out, right? And so affirmative action is meant to correct this hangover. It's a hangover medicine such that we can have a more equitable society where there's more equitable income rates among racial lines, right? And so affirmative action is supposed to get us to that state of affairs. Okay, Johnson's thesis is that none of these justifications work, right? And so affirmative action is unjustified and it should be abandoned, right? So he's going to go through each one of these justifications, talk about objections to each one of them, and say why they don't work. That's our big goal here. All right. So justification one, affirmative action promotes diversity in the workplace. So here's an idea. Maybe a racially diverse workplace is something that's just intrinsically good. We should just want that for its own sake, right? It's just something that is good and we don't have to ask any questions about it. It's just a good thing, right? And so if affirmative action gets us that good thing, well, then affirmative action would be justified potentially, right? Okay. Johnson wants to say that, look, it's not the case that diversity is an intrinsic good, right? It may be an extrinsic good, but it's not just good to have diversity. So here's a case to demonstrate that that may not be quite right. Ryan's sales pitch. So Ryan, the young temp, recently promoted to salesman in this episode. Ryan and Stanley, one of the only African-American characters in The Office, also a salesman. Ryan and Stanley go on a sales call. Ryan asks Stanley if he can take the lead on the next sale. To his chagrin, the entire group of managers is Black. There's probably 4 or 5 of them. When they ask, "What do you have for us, Ryan?" all Ryan can say is "hi" over and over and over again. And then later, Stanley's laughing at Ryan in the car. He says, "All you could say was hi, hi, hi." It's funny, right? Okay, so here's this case. There's a group of managers that are all Black. Is that such a bad thing, right? Is it so bad that there's not diversity among that group or that set of managers at that one company, right? It doesn't seem like we should condemn this group of managers just because they are all of one race, right? And so even though they're not a diverse group, it seems like what they're doing is okay, right? And so this suggests that diversity is not an intrinsic good. Rather, I mean, it is, say it might be a good, right? But it's not something that we should just have for its own sake, right? Okay, and so if diversity is not an intrinsic good, right, then the fact that affirmative action gets us diversity isn't going to function as a justification for affirmative action. Okay, justification 2, let me move my face down here. Okay, affirmative action can or should eliminate racism. For example, majority favoring hiring practices. Okay, so we might think, so here's our tentative justification. Non-discriminatory hiring practices, e.g., affirmative action, ought to eliminate racism in the workplace, right? So affirmative action's goal and its justification is to eliminate individual prejudice towards minorities, right? So one reason to think that affirmative action is justifiable is that it makes people less racist, right? Suppose you have a racist boss, right? If they're obligated to hire a black person, right, that person will hire a black person. Whereas otherwise, if they weren't obligated, they would hire only, say, members of their own group, right? Say the majority group, which is white people. Okay, so affirmative action is supposed to make us less racist. Let me move my face again. Okay. But affirmative action clearly misses the mark here, according to Johnson. So we can meet the quota of diversity in the workplace, right? Have enough minority people that affirmative action calls for, right? And we can still be racist, right? So consider a case to help demonstrate this point. Michael is the case. Michael Scott is clearly racially insensitive and perhaps a racist himself. He's constantly making racially charged remarks to his employees, telling Kelly that, he's talking about working in a gas station, right? Talks about how Oscar, a Hispanic employee, has a Mexican cleaning ethic, right? And constantly talks about Stanley being from the ghetto. And he talks about Stanley. He gets into an argument with Stanley about why collard greens are really colored greens, because only colored people eat collard greens, right? And he's just such an idiot, right? And he's probably a racist, but at the very least, he's racially insensitive. So let's suppose that Michael Scott hires on the basis of affirmative action policies, right? Maybe that's how we get Daryl. Maybe that's how we get, like, say, Hank or Stanley, right? All of these different characters. Even though he's abiding by these policies, he himself can be racially insensitive, right? It doesn't seem like this policy is going to change some individual person's attitude towards members of minority races, right? And so there's a space for a workplace that meets the quota of diversity, right? But nevertheless exhibits a hostile work environment towards minorities, right? But Johnson notes that ending racism is not the goal of affirmative action, right? So here's a tentative justification, and that justification fails, right? But it's not actually the justification for affirmative action. And so as a consequence, we need a new justification. Okay, tentative justification number 3. Let me move my face. Affirmative action provides compensation to the descendants of injustice or punishment to majority groups. Okay, so this is really interesting because it's interesting because first of all, because people talk this way, right? And it's also interesting because he conflates. I think he's conflating on compensation and punishment. So like I said earlier, not all punishment is compensation, and not all compensation is necessarily punishment, right? So if I harm you on accident, say, I may owe you money. Maybe it's due to my own negligence that I owe you some money. But we wouldn't say that you're punishing me by demanding that I compensate you, right? Rather, you're merely demanding that you be compensated, right? So recently, my friend lost my sunglasses in the ocean. I was pretty pissed off about it. And so I was like, hey, man, you mind paying me back for those, right? It wasn't, my intention was not to, like, charge him a fine for losing my sunglasses. It's rather like, oh yeah, he, like, took responsibility for losing my sunglasses, and so he compensated me for it, his own negligence, right? So it's not the case that that all punishment is compensation. And if that's right, then we can rework this case a little bit. So let's talk about the punishment side of the discussion. So Johnson seems to frame compensation obligations as a kind of punishment, which is probably not right, according to everything that I've been saying just now, right? But let's bracket that. So here's a problem case for interpreting affirmative action as a kind of punishment. So consider Dwight versus Stanley for the regional manager job. So suppose that Michael Scott seeks out a new regional manager for the Scranton branch. Of the two applicants, Dwight is more qualified than Stanley. However, suppose that Dwight's grandfather wouldn't hire Stanley's grandfather at Trout Beet Farm simply because Dwight's grandfather was a racist. Does this fact, right, that there was an injustice done by Stanley and Dwight's ancestors, does that fact justify Michael in hiring Stanley over Dwight, even though Dwight is clearly, or let's say demonstrably, more qualified than Stanley? So Johnson wants to say that we can't hold Dwight responsible for Dwight's grandfather's actions towards Stanley's grandfather, right? And so in this case, we should merely go with merit, right? Because it's not fair to punish Dwight for what his grandfather has done to Stanley's grandfather, right? Okay, so when we frame it in terms of punishment, I think that this is just absolutely right. But if we frame this in terms of obligation, then I think we're going to have a little bit trickier analysis of this case. So consider a compensation principle, a plausible compensation principle. It's called the beneficiary pays principle. According to this principle, is that in some cases, those who have benefited from an injustice can have compensation obligations to those who were the victim of that injustice, right? So suppose that I steal from you, right? And then I give some of my money to my mother, right? So according to the beneficiary pays principle, you not only have right to condemn me, right, to make me compensate you, you also have the right to demand that my mother compensate you as well. Because why? Well, because she has benefited from an injustice, which is my stealing from you, right? And so you can hold both of us accountable for my responsibility, according to the beneficiary pays principle. This is why this principle is really interesting, because you don't have to have done something wrong to owe somebody something. So let's think that, let's consider Dwight and Stanley's grandfathers, right? So Dwight's grandfather has done an injustice to Stanley's grandfather, right? And let's suppose that Dwight has benefited in virtue of that injustice, right? Maybe it would be clear to say that Stanley's grandfather is a slave and Dwight's grandfather is a slave owner, right? So Dwight may have benefited economically, right? He may have had more advantages growing up in virtue of this past wealth, right? So he's benefited from an injustice, and Stanley has stood in a kind of disadvantage because of this injustice. According to the beneficiary pays principle, it might be that Dwight is obligated to compensate Stanley because of his grandfather's actions, right? And that's not because Dwight himself is a racist. It's not because Dwight himself is has done anything racist or has partook in the institution of slavery, but merely in virtue of being a beneficiary, Dwight may have some compensation obligations to Stanley, right? So if we think of the beneficiary pays principle, we can actually respond pretty interestingly to understanding affirmative action as a kind of compensation, right? And if this is right, then we might be able to push back a little bit on Johnson's analysis here. So anyway, that's super interesting. And I like to write about the beneficiary pays principle. So I think that there's room to interpret and think about that principle in this discussion for sure. So then we have our tentative justification number 4. And this is the one that Johnson argues is the actual justification for affirmative action. So affirmative action as a kind of correction of the present effects of past discrimination or reverse discrimination, which we'll talk about that in a moment. So he lays out in the essay, he lays out 4 ways in which the history of slavery and the history of racism has disadvantaged minority groups, right? At least in an American context, right? If you want to see those claims, go back to the text, right? We're not going to talk about those per se. We're just going to take it as sort of granted that there is a problem that's due to the history of slavery, the history of racism, right? There's just inequalities and disadvantages. Okay, so affirmative action is justified by the fact that it raises the poverty bar for minorities, right? That is, it corrects the present effects of discrimination from the past. The idea here is that due to this kind of historical trajectory, right, many minority groups have been disadvantaged, right? They don't come from as much wealth, right? They don't have as many advantages. And so there's a kind of bar, right? And so we want to just like raise that overall socioeconomic status, or that overall sort of average socioeconomic income level, right? Okay. So that's the goal of affirmative action. And so the way that it works is that, look, if companies have to hire people who are from minority groups, right, then we're slowly raising that average, right, among that community. And so the poverty bar raises with every hire based on affirmative action, right? And so we slowly bring the bar up over time. And eventually we won't need it, right? Affirmative action. Because the income levels across races will be roughly comparable. Okay, so the problem here that Johnson points out is that making hiring decisions on the basis of race is what he calls reverse discrimination. That is discrimination directed at majority groups, right? So this seems to be a problematic thing to do, according to Johnson. Right? We should, if we can help it, we should raise the poverty bar without appealing to any sort of discrimination, right? Okay. But he does claim that, like, look, good outcomes will sometimes justify discrimination. The idea here being that if you discriminate against somebody and it has a good outcome, right, well, then you can justifiably discriminate against somebody. That's the sort of idea here. It's almost, he's almost sort of working, Johnson's almost working like a consequentialist here, right? So if you have to discriminate against somebody, right, in order to prevent nuclear holocaust, say, maybe it's okay to do that. So anyway, so he gives this case about a justifiable instance of reverse discrimination. So let's consider Hank Tate. This guy's the security guard in The Office. He's only in a few episodes, so if you haven't seen him, you just Google him, right? So Hank is the security guard at the office building where Dunder Mifflin is. So suppose that the security guard at Dunder Mifflin, the old security guard at Dunder Mifflin, was a white racist. He routinely checked only Black employees, that is Daryl and Stanley, to make sure that they didn't steal or they don't steal. Detecting the outrage among his Black employees, Michael fires the old security guard and hires Hank Tate, a Black man, over a more qualified white man. So hiring a Black man quells the tension in his branch, right? People aren't quite as upset anymore, right? And so Michael discriminates in order to appease his angry employees, which Johnson argues is a good outcome, right? So here's the question. Suppose that, or if there are other means available to Michael that do not involve discrimination to pacify his angry employees, should he take those means? And the answer, Johnson says, is yes, right? So if we have to bring about a good outcome, and we have two options to bring about the good outcome, we can either discriminate against somebody, or we can do something else that doesn't involve discriminating against somebody. We should like go with the option that doesn't discriminate against somebody else, right? Okay. So in this case, it seems like Michael is justified in discriminating against the job applicant, right? Only if that's his only option, right? If that's his only option, it's morally okay. If it's not his only option, then it's morally not okay, right? Okay, so the claim here is that if there's a way to gain the good outcomes of affirmative action without discriminating against anybody, we should prefer those means over affirmative action, since affirmative action, according to our author, involves a kind of reverse discrimination, right? Okay, so Johnson says, yes, there is a way to have to get the outcomes of affirmative action without using affirmative action in the workplace, and that's the education option. Let me move my face. And so, according to Johnson, the education option is a way to increase, right, the overall poverty bar without using affirmative action in the workplace. And so he thinks that this is a way to raise the poverty bar without discrimination, right? And so if we get more minorities into big schools, into colleges, they will be overall better off at the end of the day, right? That'll increase that poverty bar slowly. Okay, so one problem with this might be that we're just moving the problem around, right? There's just going to be reverse discrimination done at colleges, right? So that might be one problem with this response, right? So anyways, we've looked at 4 tentative justifications for affirmative action, and using the office as a kind of case book, we followed Johnson in looking at why all of these tentative justifications fail. So thanks for listening to my lecture.